Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to another Bevington Group webinar, this time to talk about risk intelligence, and very timely it is as the world once again appears very uncertain and volatile. But before I start, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm speaking. They are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Right. So we're going to get started with what's going to happen today. So risk intelligence, I don't need to tell you what's happening in the world from a volatility perspective or an uncertainty perspective. I think it's pretty clear that there's plenty going on. What we'll do in this particular webinar is cover risk intelligence, which is different from risk management. We'll talk about that very briefly, but it is a very strategic way to think about risk. And nowhere is this more relevant than at the time we live in now, or no time. There is a way to send us questions. We often don't have time to respond on the webinar to the questions, but do feel free, excuse me, to send them to webinar@bevingtongroup.com. Okay, so agenda for today, we'll define risk intelligence, contrast it against risk management. We'll talk about useful knowledge about risk. So what could you know that's useful? And we'll talk about a particular model, two particular models. We'll get through some examples and we'll talk about how you build a risk intelligent enterprise. And it overlaps with some other theories, particularly theories on adaptability and particularly theories on resilience. Okay, so let's start with some basics. So what is risk? Well, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, it's the possibility of something bad happening or that something bad might happen. Of course, some people say that risk can be positive. We're going to call that reward. Now, risk both addresses quantifiable and unquantifiable uncertainty. This is the first rather dry thing, I'm afraid, that I've got to get out of the way. And I'll talk about mild risk and wild risk. One of the things to realize is that when we're doing our risk assessments in risk management, we're often putting a probability on something as well as assessing an impact. The probabilities that we put on things are often highly subjective. It's very hard to get that right. In games of chance, like when we roll the dice, or we're playing with a pack of cards with a known potential probability outcome, those are certain and quantifiable in the sense that you can put a numerical probability on them with some certainty. Pretty much everything else that we're dealing with, actually, it's fuzzy, to say the least. We can't really put precise probability on things. And in some cases, we can be wildly wrong, actually. And we don't need to think too far back in time to the pandemic when we got some things wildly wrong. We were wildly unprepared in hindsight. So wild risk really relates to this idea that there are lots of unquantifiable and uncertain risks out there. And the strategic question is, how do you actually handle this? So we're going to actually talk about that right now. But first, well, we should say risk is encountered all over the place, of course. We've risk geopolitically, we've risk economically, but risk appears in standards like ISO 31000. In finance and economics, there's attempts to quantify risk based on volatility. Is risk really volatility? Possibly not, but that's another conversation. It appears in project management. When you're doing your risk assessments, it appears in corporate planning documents where there's a risk assessment and there's a risk appetite statement. Health, safety, IT, cyber. Risk is everywhere. We can't lead our organizations without having a very high degree of sensitivity to risk. And that doesn't mean not doing things, as we'll come to in a few minutes' time. Now, risk management is something we're familiar with, of course. Many of you will be familiar with this 5x5 matrix or an alternative, but essentially it's you identify a risk, you put a probability on that risk and you assess its outcome or its impact, and you try to make sure that you deal with the problems that are likely and have a high impact. So you're looking for these reds. So you've got a certain degree of certainty and a degree of high risk. You really want to deal with these reds, and that's where much of the effort goes. So that's the idea. And that's useful, but it's only part of what it means to be risk intelligence, because risk intelligence is broader than risk management. So risk management is an activity, family of activities where you identify a risk and identify the impact and then figure out what you can do about that, either affecting the probability or affecting the impact or both. Both would be ideal. Risk intelligence is actually a cluster of competencies that define broadly how we approach risk. And it accepts that there's no risk without return, or there's no return without risk, I should say, but it also addresses the issue of resilience and addresses the issue of adaptability. Because if something bad happens, there's a question as to how resilient you are, and there's a question as to how fast you can adapt. Now, risk intelligence or its absence can also have a big impact on decision making. So risk intelligence and decision making are very, very closely related. So if you look at the elements of risk intelligence, they look very much like elements from good decision making. So risk perception, analytical and critical thinking, strategic thinking, decision making under uncertainty. Well, we're there now, there's no question. Emotional and interpersonal communication, cognitive regulation. So this is metacognition, being aware of how you're thinking, technical skills for designing and applying risk frameworks. I'm going to talk about those in a few minutes' time. Beyond risk management, we're going to give you some other frameworks, adaptability. So risk intelligence is broader. It relates to decision making, and it also takes into account a great deal of capability. Okay, so let's now get into useful models. So if risk intelligence is broader than risk management, how can we think about it? Now, one of the models that we like, because it relates to a great deal of other research, which we can dig into if you want to contact us, but one useful framework comes from Australian academic Roberts, who in 2020 published the RRR approach, which is risk, reward, and resilience. And this relates to another favorite of ours, Taleb, who we think has some very useful things to say about how organizations can run. So the idea here is don't just think about what can go wrong, the risk, think about the reward, but also think about resilience. Now, if we go back to that idea that said some of the risks, in fact, many of the risks, you can't really be sure as to the quantitative impact, and sometimes you'll actually be wildly wrong. It's a good idea to think about organizational resilience. So the concept here is that if you don't know what will impact your organization and you can't be sure, it's a good idea to make sure that your organization can withstand effectively risks that you can't even anticipate properly. So resilience is particularly important. So there's the ability to absorb an impact, adapt in the short term, and transform in the long term. So there's very much a piece of this, which is you can stay standing and then you can change to adapt to new circumstances. Now, this is, we think, an under-stressed idea in what is often the thinking on decision making, because often it's a longer term concept. You have to do some operating model work or some other change to make sure your organization is adaptive and has the ability to transform when faced with both expected and unexpected risks. But this is a sensible balance. You're considering the risk, you're considering the reward, and you're considering resilience, and you're making sure that you're chasing a reward for which you understand the risks. So a very, very sensible way to think about things. So diving into that a little bit, what do we consider when we're thinking about the risk? Well, we think about the hazard, the extent to which we're exposed to that hazard, and our vulnerability to that hazard. Vulnerability is particularly interesting, which are the characteristics that can exacerbate that particular risks. In other words, we might be in a position where particularly we're vulnerable relative to others, and that might relate to exposure. Then there's reward, which is opportunity, access, and capability, which is the benefit. And some of the benefits can be long-term, for example, or medium-term. You might get a benefit that's an access to channel or institutions from which you can get a later benefit, or you're building a capability. They are benefits, and it's useful to think about strategic benefits for taking a risk as well. And very importantly for this particular webinar, resilience. So the delightful thing about resilience, even if you get your risk assessment numbers wrong, which is nearly inevitable because much of the real world risks we're assessing are subjective, you can still prepare your organization for a very difficult and challenging world with a great deal of uncertainty by making sure you can absorb the risk, adapt to the risk, and that your organization's structured, designed, that you can actually transform if you need to. So it's very sensible. Now, we're operating model designers and process engineers, so we're systems thinkers. And systems thinkers know that different parts of the world are connected, and they can be connected in unexpected ways. And what Roberts does in a triple R approach is point out that actually drivers for risk, drivers for reward, drivers for resilience can interact. So if you're exposed to a risk, that might relate to your ability to get access to particular, for example, channels or markets. But it does require a degree of exposure. So there's a positive correlation, but there can be negative correlations as well. So this says we'll have a stop and have a think about how things are correlated. But one point I will make is it's actually quite difficult to get all the correlations, positive and negative, right and accurate. It's a matter of being aware that things are connected. And again, one of the best strategies you can deploy under those circumstances is to be balanced in the risks you pursue for the appropriate reward and make sure that your organization is broadly resilient. But in terms of good systems thinking, which is the reality of the world, things are connected, then you're in good shape to think this way. Now, one of the reasons we like the triple R approach, it does relate to a favorite of ours, which is Taleb. And the reason we like Taleb is because we're operating model designers. And when we're thinking about operating models, what we don't want to do is design an organization effectively, which is fragile. We want to build as much resilience into the model as possible. So if you think of the usual term or the usual meaning of resilience, usually in common language, people think of robust, which is something bad happens and you can return effectively to normal operations. And it's often associated with traditional risk management. What Taleb's talking about, and in fact, the resilience model in Triple R is talking about, is something a little bit broader than that and a little bit deeper. What it says is that you can actually recover and actually adapt to the new circumstance. And Taleb goes further and says you can actually be stronger. So if you're anti-fragile as a human being or as an organization or as a team, stresses can make you stronger. And in particular, Taleb talks about stress and rest. So small stresses, for example, over time can make you stronger and much more able to deal with the larger stresses. And this ability to get better as a consequence of stress and actually to get better as a consequence of uncertainty, to get stronger in a situation of uncertainty, is a Taleb popularized idea. So this relates particularly nicely to the work of Roberts, and certainly we think about it very deeply when we are doing operating model design, as we don't want to actually design processes or structures or models that are inherently fragile. So you have to think about, is there a sensible approach to thinking about how you make your organizations resilient or how you make your organizations anti-fragile? And there are 6 ideas here which we think give you a really cracker start. First of all, optionality. So each time you build in an option to decisions you make, not just operating model or process, but it could be markets that you enter, products you design, people you hire, M&A opportunities you pursue, by seeking situations where you've got options, in other words, you've got choices later on and you're not backed into a corner, you're effectively increasing your degree of anti-fragility, and that's a risk-intelligent decision to take. Of course, each option has a price. You want to check that it's sustainable and affordable, but generally having more choices in a situation of stress later is a good idea. So making sure you've got choices. It appears to be the case from the research that skin in the game is a good idea. So this gets around the problem of agency theory, where basically leadership act in their own interest as opposed to the interest of the entity as a whole. So skin in the game matters, but that matters in all sorts of theories. Barbell strategy is an idea that comes from Taleb, and this is about a portfolio of projects that you're pursuing. And I use projects in the broader sense of the word. It could be new products, it could be new markets, it could be M&A, it could be a systems transformation, it could be process work or an operating model design, it could be all sorts of projects. And what Taleb's really saying here, when you put it in our language, is build a portfolio of changes that you want to make to your organization that have a left and right-hand side of the barbell. And in our language, your left-hand side addresses improving the organization as is. Think of it as continuous improvement, or taking a fundamentally the same model and making it better, even making it more resilient, more stable, it'll have better customer service, but the fundamental model is not different. And then the right-hand side is sprinkling of more radical ideas that if you lose on these ideas, it doesn't really matter. You can afford the loss. And this is a distinctly Taleb idea, which is on the right-hand side, you have a form of risk where you know the cost, but you don't know the benefit, and the benefit could be enormous. So you build a portfolio of projects, and some of them should be quite radical. That's a good way to be anti-fragile, because you give yourself the chance of being ready for a radical shift in markets. Now, centralization has its benefits, and one of the terms that's often used in operating model design is centralize to standardize and then decentralize. And why that second step? So centralization is good for standardization, but these days there are other ways to do that. We'll come to those in a few minutes' time. But decentralization, it's quite clear in the research, does leave you into a situation where you're more adaptable to local market changes. So this is particularly true of organizations that operate in markets that are materially different. So putting local control with local managers who understand the context, but operate with very clear guidelines and with good management training. And good management training is often something that's absent, is a very good way to be anti-fragile and resilient. Now we'll come a little bit more, we'll cover a little bit more on redundancy and slack in a few minutes' time. But the idea here, if you've got a little bit of redundancy, a little bit of slack, usually that's put onto non-critical projects. Not that you don't use that slack, you just basically have that slack or that resource or that money deployed on non-critical projects. You can swing it into action to help save the organization in the event of a crisis. That gives you time to adapt. And there's a very interesting idea in the bottom right-hand corner, which we haven't talked about much in the past, which is via negativity. Now here, the idea is that you have elements of your structure, your processes, your org design, your technologies that actually are sources of fragility. Bureaucracy and excessive complexity being one of them, or two of them, I should say. And you consciously remove them to make yourself both more robust, less likely to break, and more agile. In other words, you can adapt or transform. So basically, you remove things that are sucking energy from the organization for very little value. We haven't talked about that much, but it is actually a strategy that's well worth considering. So if you just, from a risk intelligence perspective, looked at your organization and thought about these 6 elements, you'd be off to a pretty good cracking start. So the idea of anti-fragility, which, as I said, links through to Taleb's work and links through to Robert's work and many others, and has a really big relevance, particularly for org design, but for technology, for product development, and so much more. It's an enormous range of practical applications. Let's just delve into one at the moment. But one of the things I will say is that a key benefit for thinking in terms of fragility and anti-fragility is that it is a property of a system that can be observed in the present. So this is a really, really big point. So it's very difficult to predict the future. That point that was made at the beginning, that you can't really often put a very accurate probability on something that's deeply subjective. It can be difficult to anticipate, for example, the acts of global leaders that might have an act on your economy. So, but what you can do is look at what's a reality of the present, and you can look at how fragile your organization is. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll see a quote from someone called Howard Marks. Howard Marks is a very well-known US investor, very well known for actually effectively starting a market in subprime bonds. And he says, like most things occurring in the future, risk cannot be anything except a matter of opinion. But if you're thinking of fragility, Let's go to another quote. He said, while we can't see where we're going, we ought to have a good sense of where we are. And this is the beauty of understanding how fragile you are. It's a condition of the present. So you don't need to predict. You can do something about that now. Now, from a management and decision-making perspective, this is unbelievably valuable. So let's have a look at some examples. Let's look at fragile, robust, and anti-fragile, and with a very big nod to Taleb here, because this is language that comes from him. Now, fragile, this is hates uncertainty. And think of an organization that is a narrow product offer and has a long lead time to develop new products. So the market can change. It takes a long time to adapt, and it's in real trouble. It's fragile. Let's think of robust, an organization that has many products. They're diverse. They cover many markets. If there's a problem in one market, it still has all the rest. And that buys it some time to adapt, and that is robust. Now, anti-fragile, it would introduce a new attribute. Strictly speaking, it should have elements of the middle attribute, but we have a new attribute, and that is a short lead time to produce products. So in this case, a really truly anti-fragile organization would have a narrow product offer per market. Actually, ideally, it would be robust as well, and it would be across multiple markets, but can it adapt very, very quickly? So this really now has started to get us into the idea of adaptation, which is you might be able to put up some defensive walls, some contingencies, but you might just have to adapt because the situation is going to exist for some time. So we'll have a little look at some of the risks we can introduce for ourselves. We're going to have a little look at over-optimization. Now, Bevington does optimization for a living, but there's an idea in our process work that comes from the lean philosophy, which is always leave some spare capacity because you don't know what's happening. And that's very much a form of fortification, buys you time to adapt. We'll come to a little bit more on that in a few minutes' time. But if you over-optimize and leave yourself no slack, that might be good for a while, but it might be leaving you fragile going forward. So you want to be careful that you've left yourself a bit of slack. Now, often actually, what practically happens though, by optimizing, by actually making your processes more efficient, what you're actually doing is allowing, for example, yourself the opportunity to pursue more income, reduce cost, improve customer service and improve customer loyalty, and gives you the ability to put a bit of money aside. So you very much still pursue it because it actually gives you the opportunity to build your fortress and be more robust. And happy customers actually is a form of fortification because customers will often not leave immediately. Sometimes they do, though. So let's have a look at some of the examples of fragility, resilience through the triple R model. So let's think of a supplier network. So if you have a single supplier network across different regions, so basically your whole organization relies on one supplier, you actually are in a situation where you're potentially fragile. So if something goes wrong with that supplier, so you might think about reducing your exposure under the triple R model so that you're not quite as exposed to that supplier everywhere. You might also think, because this is a system that if you're reducing your exposure, can you use that to improve a reward? Because if you've got multiple suppliers, you can use that to create price tension. So that might be a reward or at least offset some of the costs of basically reducing your exposure to a single supplier. Not all of the costs, because sometimes the single supplier is extremely attractive because of that monetary benefit of efficiency, but it does introduce a risk. And a resilience enhancement would go one step further, which is you'd also stockpile, or you'd have a reserve of some of the most important elements for you, which would be extremely useful in dramatic supply chain disruption. Of course, the cost of that has to be built in. And sometimes when we're involved, people actually pay for that by actually making their overall system more efficient. And remember, being more efficient is actually anti-fragile because your core system's efficient and you can therefore invest in adaptability and invest in some sort of buffer. So that's a way to think about it. So you can see, for example, that exposure reduction should lead you to think about how you can take an advantage of it to get an additional reward that might at least offset the cost of investment and exposure reduction. So another lens you can take or apply is the triple R lens to centralization. So centralization is actually extremely useful, and sometimes it's absolutely necessary, but you just have to be aware of some of the risks of centralization. So if too many decisions are made over too broad a scope, you can get decision fatigue. So people in the center making lots of decisions. This is particularly true in a crisis. So in an overall crisis situation, too many decisions in the center can be inappropriate because they're not adapted to local conditions, and you can get decision fatigue. So you can have a radically uncertain event that can lead to decentralization of decision making, that can lead to fragility, particularly where there's a broad scope of decisions. So it's worthwhile considering in a crisis, should you be centralized or decentralized? Well, of course, it's a blend of both. Some decisions do need to be made centrally, including your strategic posture, but you would consider decentralizing decisions where those close to the ground are best placed to make a good decision. Now, you can rebalance that decision making in a crisis, that tendency to centralize decision making in a crisis in various ways. You can create a local response team empowered to make real decisions. You can invest in people, not just processes, because sometimes the processes will become out of date because the circumstances change. So you want to teach people adaptive problem solving. And we certainly think that above a certain level of management, you should be confident of all of your managers' adaptive problem solving capabilities in an increasingly risky world, certainly in terms of uncertainty. And some redundancy in leadership is good. Rotating people through high decision intensity teams is a good idea to make sure that you don't have burnout. So centralization of decision making in a crisis is particularly what this relates to. Okay, so how do you build a risk intelligent enterprise? So adaptability and subsequently transformation are really, really important elements of resilience because you can account for new circumstances. So your buffers give you time to adapt and potentially give you time to transform. So here are some examples. You might think about sourcing. You might think about management discipline. You might think about the financial structure, information, and functional design. I've already covered some sourcing examples. Management discipline examples, which is how do you respond in a crisis? Do you centralize everything? That's an example. Is it centralized decision making? Financial structure is interesting. You might actually have multiple companies so that the fire breaks are in place so that you don't get, for example, a problem where one company goes broke and drags everyone else down with it. You might think about information. Now, here we're talking about something other than just being resilient to the event when it's happened, but about seeing it happen and reacting in time. This is your ability to smell an early change in the air, your sense and respond mechanisms that are particularly useful, and then functional design. So you need a lean corporate center in most cases, because that lean corporate center basically leaves decision-making on markets, particularly in a crisis, to those parts of the organizations that are close to the real meaning of the data that they're getting, and understand that market deeply. So those are ways to think about it. So if you actually pause, step back, and think of everything we've said, there's one simple way to express it and to express it to your teams and managers, is to say, well, really what we're doing is, because not all risk is perfectly known in terms of probability and even in terms of impact, you're fortifying the organization to basically address where it's fragile, where you're not entirely sure what's going to happen, but you know there are places where you can break. So you're going to fortify yourself so you can manage those breaks if they happen. And that buys you time to adapt. It's a good idea to improve your organizational ability to adapt. So really, if you're thinking from a risk intelligence perspective, you're doing both of these things. Now, adaptation has all sorts of other benefits as well, of course. It's not just if something bad happens, but you can adapt to opportunity as well and take opportunity. And some of the best organizations in the world do just that. They're highly adaptive. They can pivot to grab an opportunity. Now, fortifying is traditional risk planning. So that's that risk management approach. The sense and response systems, you can see it coming early and you can act. Financial reserves, non-financial reserves, that includes people, it includes product, it includes work in progress inventory, et cetera, and then, for example, fire breaks between organizations so you don't get, for example, financial or other forms of damaging contagion. Increasing adaptability, you can have an agile organizational model, you can sense, scale, and swarm, and you can test that you can do that. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I'm going to talk about mission leadership. I'll talk a little bit about bureaucracy. And strategy one, strategy two thinking is actually that Taleb's barbell strategy that I talked about. So on the left-hand side, projects as we usually conceive them, improving the present, which has a roughly known risk profile. And I say roughly because if you're doing a major systems change, that can often be very, very hard to predict what's going to happen. But strategy one, strategy two is where you experiment with very dramatic changes. Okay. So I said I'd explain sense, scale, and swarm. One way you can adapt to a situation is sense it's happening early. So that's part of it. So get your sensing systems working. Having enough capacity that you can release from whatever they're doing at the moment so they can scale, which is the right people huddle and gather around a problem in the right numbers. That's scale. And swarm is where they actually then start to organize around that problem to be able to address it. So classic example is Nokia was the first to recognize that there was a risk in the Philips plant network and they needed supply from Philips. And in fact, Philips supplied the worlds for these particular products or these particular components. Nokia, when they sensed the risk before the problem happened, was the first to pull resources off other projects and business lines and problems. They were important, but they could wait. And they pulled them off and put them into the team even before they knew how to organize. And then in swarming, they were the first to organize around the problem and solve it. So their biggest competitor at the time was Ericsson. Ericsson took a $2.58 billion hit. And needless to say, Nokia did much, much better. So Nokia had a way of sensing, scaling, releasing people to deal with the problem, and then swarm around the problem. This is inherently adaptive. And this is leaving some capacity in your organization. It's not that the capacity was sitting idle, it was working on projects, but they knew who and what they could take off projects in the event of an emergency. So they did. Now, if you're thinking in a risk intelligent perspective, you're thinking about risk, you're thinking about reward, and you're thinking about resilience. You're thinking about where you're fragile and what you can do to make sure that fragility doesn't become a problem for you. And leaders have a very important role. So things that leaders need to think about, they should avoid unnecessary fragilities, and we can introduce those into our organization. They should be open in the communications. So if there's a problem happening, it's okay to let people know what's happening so that they can do something about it and lean in with you to solve it. They're clear about roles and accountabilities. Now, maybe not immediately in the event of a crisis, you're just putting the right people in the room and then together you're clear in your objectives. They encourage and enable learning. Learning is inherently adaptive, and we should all be learning all the time. Now, one of the features of agile organizations is they're very adaptive, and I'm talking about agile organizational structures, which are becoming increasingly common. But without good leadership, autonomous teams can become disconnected from the whole. So leadership is still important. They need to ensure seamless technologies, and they're important for communication, for example, in a crisis. And we're talking about crisis, but you can be fragile in normal business too. They lead scenario planning. Scenario planning is extremely important because what you're actually doing in a scenario planning is you're thinking about a range of scenarios and identifying the strategies that work in all scenarios and using those strategies. And they ensure appropriate empowerment and devolution, particularly when you sense, scale, and swarm. So, but it does mean that leaders need to be aware of risk intelligence and the fact that it's a way of thinking about things. The triple R way is a good shorthand for that, and have a clear understanding of what a resilient organization is and what an adaptive organization is. So building resilience becomes something that they do, assuming the worst is yet to come is very important. So this is really, really important because Fukushima, for example, was built to withstand the worst earthquake that was known, and then something worse happened, including a tsunami that wiped out a generator. So you should always assume the worst happens, and that the worst can be worse than you've seen before, and look at the fragile parts of your organization accordingly. You'll balance risk and operational efficiency. You should be operational efficient because then you can afford to invest in adaptability, but you should put some of that money aside to allow you to deal with that rainy day thunderstorm scenario. And then there's volatility. So volatility actually is not something you should be frightened of. You should use that volatility to basically stress and rest, become stronger as an organization because you practice your models of adaptation. You practice your ability to adapt. So think of small fires. Preventing a massive forest fire can be a good thing. And sometimes you have to introduce your own volatility. I suspect that for many of us, it's happening anyway. So look at the good side to that. Now, one of the features of adaptive organization is often a mission-centered approach to leadership. This is not simple to implement, but it works very well. It is aligned with agile ways of thinking, but it can be deployed separately. And this is where you basically train managers to be effectively clear on mission for the organization, right down to their mission as a team and as a leader of a team, have rules that are black and white and must not be broken. So therefore there are few of them, or as few as you can get away with, but they are black and white and they are unbreachable, and then guidelines. And the reason for fewer rules, more guidelines is because that's more adaptive, because don't make something that's a rule that might not apply in a whole range of situations, because then you're introducing a fragility. That's the concept. But for this to work, you need to train your leaders to make decisions, and you need to train and coach leaders to deploy guidelines properly so that they're making a decision that's consistent with the way you want them to make decisions. So therefore, you see these key elements. Staff have to understand the mission. There has to be a decision-making clear framework with a distinction between rules and guidelines. Teams need to have the information. They need to have the authority. They need to have the skills to detect changes that they need to respond to. We need to trust them, and we do need to teach them in basically risk intelligence and decision-making. Now, if you wanted to get a sense of how adaptive your own organization is, you can think along these lines and ask a series of questions. Are we moving from perfection to speed? Perfection can be a problem because nothing gets done until it's perfect. That's not adaptive. So even if you've got to rework a bit some of the imperfect implementations that you've done, but they got you further along, that might be a better option. It's certainly more anti-fragile. Planning is important. You have to plan. But some degree of flexibility in your plan is a good idea. And there are a range of planning theories that allow you to do this. We call one of them lean planning theory. It's based on essentially the design of hybrid vehicles by Toyota, which is you have a much closer idea of what you're doing in the next 3 months than you do the following 3, 6, 9, 12. But notwithstanding that, you have a clear idea of the architecture of where you're going and the arc of where you're going. But there's more detail earlier. Otherwise, you're constantly reworking a plan that's not going to be deployed in detail, maybe 2 years out. That's an idea. It's not actually appropriate for all circumstances. You wouldn't build a bridge this way, but it's appropriate for many. Optimization is important, but if you are optimization, you make sure you invest in diversification and efficient slack. Efficient slack is effectively where you've made the processes as efficient as possible. You take some of that, you deploy some of that resource into projects, for example, that you can stop if you need to in the event of an emergency. You think about hierarchy versus empowerment. Now, hierarchies work. They've worked for a very, very long time. There's a very famous org designer who wrote a text called In Defense of Hierarchy. However, they do have limitations, and where they are associated with a lack of empowerment, particularly where leaders are in the front line and have to make decisions day to day with customers, they can be very anti-fragile. Now, blaming is a real problem. It's moved from blaming to learning, and resource lock-in, everything is locked in and cannot be moved. That's not so good. then this is possibly one of the ones that's worst in terms of anti-fragility. So they're tests to apply to your own organization and get a sense of how fragile or how anti-fragile you are. Now, it's a good idea in the final slides to talk about culture. So cultural considerations and high-performing teams theory are important. So we tend to do an awful lot of emailing. Actually calling instead to prevent an understanding is a good anti-fragile habit. Also building strong relationships and relationships that matter, and trust is very, very useful. So talking to each other, not just emailing, not just sending in Teams messages, is also very useful. So build in that time to talk. Hold purposeful meetings. Make sure the time together is efficient and collaborative. So it's still true in a lot of organizations, we have everybody everywhere in every meeting. That's lovely, but actually it frustrates people who are often trying to get things done. And it actually sucks time from people who really don't need to be there. But you still need to hold meetings, but make them deliberate, make them collaborative, make them sensible. Build connections. I think that's that team thing we talked about. Express appreciation. It builds trust. It builds the bank of cookies in the cookie jar that you might need to draw from in an emergency, and be authentic. So be more authentic at work. Bring your whole self at work is a good idea. And it's particularly good for building, as I said, those relationships for when a crisis happens. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about thinking about the social structure of an organization. A robust social structure is very helpful when you're about to deal with a crisis or have to change. And as I said, you do actually want some volatility. You want mini crises to get stronger. And that's going to be really, really important so that things don't fall apart in the event of an emergency. You like these people, you trust these people, and you can work with these people. Okay. So that's the end of the journey on risk intelligence. So we've talked about the fact that when we do risk assessments, we don't often understand the probability. So it's very important that we actually have a way of thinking about the impact. So we're guessing some of the probabilities in our risk management, and that's just a reality. We can't know. Howard Marks particularly talks about that. He's been an exceptionally successful investor. Howard Marks says something that's very important, which is we might not know the future, but we do or should know the condition we're in today. And that's about making sure we deal with resilience and fragility. So this is where Triple R comes in and asks us to think not just about the risk, and it gives us a more sophisticated way to think about risk, but also about the reward and also about resilience. And that resilience is to do with anti-fragility or fragility that we can look at today and we can address, even if we can't accurately predict probabilities on future outcomes, because we're not great at forecasting the future. And there's good reason for that. It's because the world's a complicated space. And then we've addressed ways in which you can think about risk intelligence. You can become effectively more resilient, effectively more adaptive, and be ready for the next crisis. And we talked about how important it is to actually be adaptive on an ongoing basis, to stress the organization, have a rest, get stronger each time. We've given some practical advice as to how you can think about the operating model. We've given some practical advice as to how you can think about how resilient your operating model is, particularly in terms of adaptation. And then that allowed us to think effectively about fortification and adaptation. Your buffers effectively are buffers that allow you time to adapt. So it's a good idea to have some buffer. It's a good idea to be practiced at adaptation. Don't just learn to be adaptive when you're in the middle of a crisis. Be good at it now. It gives you benefits which include responding to opportunities, seeing, sensing, responding to those opportunities, and responding quickly, often ahead of others. So there are very big upsides. So, and make sure you're efficient enough so you can take some basically unhelpful cost and pop it into efficiency, which might, for example, if your corporate drop to the bottom line, but set some aside for adaptability, because that's going to be really useful, and set some aside so that you've got a buffer, which is the time to adapt. So we've gone therefore from probabilities and our difficulty forecasting the future right through to ways of being resilient and adaptive, because we can see where we are fragile, because that's a condition, to paraphrase Howard Marks, of our context today. And then we can do something about that. Doing something about that is fundamentally risk intelligent. All right, it's 9 o'clock. That brings us to a close. I hope you've very much enjoyed the presentation and it's giving you some interesting ideas in a world where there may be more surprises, and there certainly is plenty of uncertainty ahead of us. Thank you for joining us. Feel free to send us some questions. And as always, we like to finish on time, so stop it from here.